"Mr. John, do you need a place to unwind tonight?" Amy asked, her voice trembling. "Not just with your words, but hearing them yourself. It makes even me feel disgusted." She spoke the words almost as if she was trying to convince herself. The situation felt surreal, and she couldn't deny the sickening feeling that crept up on her. But she had no other choice. She had to do this, had no way out now. John looked at her with a calm expression. After a moment of silence, he finally spoke, his voice steady. "How much would it take?" Amy's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure why, but the directness of the question made her nervous. She hesitated for a second before answering, almost in a whisper. "1 million. Would that work?" He smirked, his lips curling slightly into a cold, emotionless smile. "All right then. Let's leave this noisy karaoke bar and go somewhere more private." Without saying another word, he led her through the bustling crowd and out into the cool night. The transition from the loud bar to the quiet streets felt like a shift into a new reality, one that she had never imagined herself in. Her mind raced, but she had no other option. She had to follow. They entered a fancy hotel, and John took her up to a room at the end of a quiet hallway. The door clicked shut behind them, and he turned to her with a serious expression. "Go take a shower," he instructed. Amy nodded without protest. As she grabbed the towel and stepped into the bathroom, she could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on her. She stood under the hot water, scrubbing herself as though she could somehow cleanse herself from the decisions she had made. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the feeling of being trapped in this life. When she finished, she stepped out of the bathroom, the towel wrapped around her body. She sat on the bed, waiting for him. Her mind was still racing, but she couldn't stop herself from wondering if he would be satisfied, if she would be good enough. John emerged from the bathroom shortly after. His body was wrapped in a towel, his expression unreadable. He looked at her for a moment before casually approaching the bed. He didn't seem rushed, but there was something in his eyes that made her stomach churn. At 30 years old, unmarried and still searching for something, he had come to a place like this to find some form of release. His desires were simple, and his expectations even simpler. Amy, like all the others, was just a means to that end. She was just doing her job. Amy lay still on the bed, feeling her nerves get the best of her. She was anxious, wondering if she could meet his expectations. She suddenly felt very young, almost out of place. "How old are you?" he asked as he noticed the innocence in her face. "I'm 22, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked at him, trying to steady her nerves. "If I had gone to school, I'd probably be graduating soon." Her words seemed to hang in the air, carrying a sense of regret, but she quickly added, "But people like me, we don't get the chance to go to school." He raised an eyebrow at her. "You're 22? You look so young. If you'd been in school, you'd probably be getting ready for graduation." His tone was almost like a casual observation, but his words stung. Amy tried to smile, but it was a weak attempt. She had once dreamed of a life like that, of attending school, having a future, but her reality had shifted long ago, and now this was her life. This was the only choice she had. "How many times have you done this?" he asked, his voice casual but his eyes full of curiosity. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected that question. "This is my first time," she said quickly, though she knew it might sound unbelievable. But there was no turning back. John raised his eyebrows. "The first time?" he asked skeptically. "Really?" Amy nodded, though she could feel his doubt. She didn't have to say anything more. He clearly didn't believe her, but she wasn't in a position to argue. He chuckled softly, then stretched out on the bed, relaxing. "Well, if you make me happy tonight, I'll pay you 5 million, he said, his tone cool and indifferent. At the mention of 5 million, Amy's breath caught in her throat. That was more money than she had ever seen in her life. She felt a strange mix of excitement and guilt. She quickly leaned forward and kissed his chest, her hands nervously reaching for the towel around his waist. Her movements were awkward, clumsy even. As she slowly untied the towel, she could feel his eyes on her, scrutinizing her every move. The sense of discomfort in the air was palpable. She wasn't sure if it was her inexperience that bothered him or something else. John watched her, a faint frown tugging at his lips. He wondered whether she was really as naive as she seemed, or if she was just pretending. In this line of work, it was hard to tell the difference. Before anything could happen, the sharp sound of a phone ringing broke the tension. Amy's eyes widened as she quickly grabbed her phone from her bag. It was the hospital. There was an emergency. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice filled with urgency. "I have to take this call." John watched her, his expression still calm but now with a hint of confusion. "An emergency?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded quickly. "I'm sorry, but I really need to take this. Please, just a few minutes." She answered the phone and spoke in hushed tones, her words rushed. After a brief but intense conversation, she hung up and immediately began dressing. "I'm really sorry, I have to go. There's an emergency at the hospital." Her voice was almost pleading. John was stunned. At this hour? What could be so urgent? Amy paused for a moment, glancing at him. "I really have to go. Can we talk tomorrow? Here's my number." She quickly grabbed a pen and a piece of paper from her bag and wrote down her phone number. "Call me tomorrow. I'll be there," she said, handing him the paper. With that, she hurriedly left the room, her footsteps echoing as she left the hotel. John sat on the bed for a moment, processing everything. The night had taken an unexpected turn, and he felt strangely unsatisfied. As he dressed, he slipped her number into his pocket. He wasn't sure why, but he felt like it might come in handy someday. As he left the hotel, he caught sight of her again. She was standing at the entrance, looking anxious. It was already past 11 p.m, and she appeared to be struggling with finding a way home. He frowned, debating whether he should just walk away. It wasn't his problem after all. But as the cool night air hit him, he couldn't ignore the feeling that maybe, just maybe, he could do something good. He walked up to her. "Need a ride?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. Her face lit up with relief. "Really? You'd do that for me?" "Of course," he said. "Get in." As they drove off into the night, John couldn't help but wonder if he had made the right choice, or if he had just complicated things even further. He glanced at her, shivering in the seat next to him. It wasn't that cold, but her thin clothing made her look fragile. In that moment, he wondered if he had made a mistake, or done something right. The night was full of questions, but no answers. John was perplexed as he drove swiftly toward the hospital, frustration building inside him. How did I get involved with this troubled girl? He thought to himself. He had no idea. As soon as he parked the car, Amy jumped out, quickly thanking him before rushing toward the entrance. He was about to drive away when he realised something. Her handbag was still in the car. Grumbling under his breath, he cursed, swung open the car door, and chased after her. But Amy was fast. She moved like a blur, her petite frame darting ahead with surprising speed. John had no idea where she was headed, or even her full name. She hadn't told him yet. It was all so confusing, frustrating, and quite frankly, a bit of a mess. He followed her into the hospital and watched as she disappeared into a ward. The hallway was cold, sterile, and smelled faintly of disinfectant. He lingered by the door, unsure of what to do next. Inside, Amy was kneeling beside a small child. A little boy, no more than 3 or 4 years old, was sitting on the bed, hugging his knees. His face was pale, and his eyes looked tired. Amy immediately embraced him, her voice soothing as she whispered comforting words. John stood there, trying to make sense of everything. He didn't know the details of her life, but somehow, seeing her with the child felt like a piece of a puzzle slowly falling into place. Just then, a nurse walked past him, glancing at him curiously. She spoke. "Are you a friend of Miss Amy?" Her question was polite, but there was an air of suspicion. John didn't answer immediately, unsure of what to say. The nurse pressed on, asking again. "Is he her partner?" She gestured toward the little boy. John finally responded, somewhat distracted. "Yes, that's her son." The nurse's eyes widened slightly. "She's just over 22. "And has a child this old?" She was clearly surprised. "Is she a single mother?" John didn't know how to respond. The nurse's question seemed too personal, but she continued with concern. "If she has a husband, why is she doing this? Why is she working in such a low-paying job?" John stared at her in silence, unable to find the right words. The nurse's judgment was evident, but Amy wasn't there for anyone's pity. He felt an unexpected empathy toward her, a feeling he hadn't anticipated. The nurse added, her voice softer now. Her son is a good boy, though. He's waiting for a bone marrow donor. John was taken aback. He had no idea. The boy was sick. It was not just an ordinary illness, it was something much more serious. She's doing this because she needs the money for his treatment, the nurse explained gently. It's not just for herself, she's trying to save him. John stood in stunned silence, trying to process it all. The realization hit him hard. Amy wasn't just a random woman he met tonight. She was a mother, desperate and doing whatever she could to save her child. He couldn't help but think of his own mother, the woman who had raised him alone. If he had been sick as a child, and they didn't have enough money for treatment, would his mother have turned to something like this? Would she have felt like there were no other choices left? John's heart softened. He no longer saw Amy as just another problem or a risky situation to avoid. He now understood. She was just a mother trying to do whatever it took for her son. Inside the room, Amy was sitting beside her son. He had fallen asleep in her arms, the exhaustion of his illness finally catching up to him. Amy carefully laid him down on the bed, placing a gentle kiss on his forehead. No matter what happens, you're my everything. I'll never give up on you, she whispered, her voice filled with unconditional love. John, standing in the doorway, watched the tender scene unfold. A sense of warmth mixed with sorrow tugged at his chest. There was something deeply moving about the love a mother had for her child, something that couldn't be bought or replaced. He felt something stir within him, an unfamiliar connection to her, something he didn't quite understand but couldn't ignore. After a while, Amy stood up, noticing something missing. Her handbag was gone. She furrowed her brow, trying to recall where she had left it. It must be in the car, she thought to herself. She remembered clearly that she'd had it when she got into John's car earlier, but now it was gone. Never mind, she muttered. It's just a cheap bag, nothing valuable inside anyway. But as she thought about it, a sense of unease settled in her chest. Her son needed money for treatment. Even a small amount could help. She had nothing of real value, but maybe there was something in that bag that could make a difference. Suddenly, she was interrupted by a voice. Looking for this? And Amy looked up in surprise. It was John. He was holding up the handbag she had lost. Oh, thank you, she exclaimed, rushing to grab it. I'm so sorry to bother you. John smiled faintly. No problem, he said, handing it over. But then he asked with a curious glance, Who's the boy in there? Amy paused for a moment, knowing he was more than likely testing her response. This wasn't just idle curiosity. In today's world, you could never be too sure. A child asking for food on the street could easily be a pickpocket in disguise. Some women might even lie about their situation for sympathy. So what would she say? Would she tell him the truth about her son? Her voice was firm, as if the decision had already been made. That's my son. I'll never deny him. He is my everything. John studied her for a moment, seeing the sincerity in her eyes. There was no doubt in his mind now. After a long pause, he finally spoke, a new sense of understanding in his voice. I didn't realise... I guess I misjudged you. Amy smiled weakly. Everyone misjudges me, but I don't need pity. I just need help for my son. John didn't respond right away, but his mind was made up. For the first time, he felt a pull to do something, to help in whatever way he could. Amy didn't need to hide anything. The only thing that needed to be hidden was the filthy life she had chosen. That boy, he's my son. He's over 3 years old now. John exhaled slowly. It seemed he wasn't mistaken after all. Where is his father? He asked, his tone calm but laced with curiosity. Amy's face fell slightly. I don't know, she replied quietly, looking away. I don't know anything about him. His appearance, his age, his occupation. I don't even know his name. I've never seen him again. She smiled faintly, shaking her head, trying to mask the pain behind her words. But John, still processing the information, couldn't help but feel a sense of disappointment. So, you don't even know who the father is, huh? Her response came with a small chuckle, almost as if to deflect the discomfort of the situation. It's not that simple. I might not know who the father is, but I assure you it's not like you think." John was puzzled. "How do you know what I'm thinking?" Amy met his gaze, her smile widening, though her eyes held a depth of understanding that startled him. "It's not hard to figure out. People like me, we can tell what others are thinking just by looking in their eyes." She gave a soft laugh, though it wasn't a joyful one. It was more of a sad acceptance, a defence mechanism honed over years of living in this world. "You'd be surprised how many people like you come through here, thinking the same things. It's nothing new." John, intrigued yet unsure, leaned back. "So, what makes you different from others in this line of work?" Amy's gaze softened. "I'm different in many ways," she said, a slight smirk playing on her lips. "For instance, you're not just another customer to me. You're the first one." John raised an eyebrow, confused. She continued, her tone light but with a hint of irony. "It's funny, isn't it? How the same profession can make us all seem alike, yet each experience is different." She laughed, a small dry chuckle escaping her lips. "It's like I'm telling you a joke, but it's not really funny." John, still unsure about where this conversation was headed, remained silent for a moment. He thought for a second, then responded, "You seem different. You don't really act like the others." Amy's eyes sparkled and she leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a more intimate tone. "You want to know how I'm different? Let me tell you." Without waiting for an answer, she spoke again, her voice cool and composed. "Unlike the others, I'm not going to pretend. No sugarcoating, no acting." She paused and looked him directly in the eye. "You think you're the only one who's looking for a quick fix? A moment of relief? You're not?" John felt his curiosity peak. He knew there was more to her than met the eye. He leaned in, his tone now softer. "You're saying you're different?" Amy nodded, her eyes distant for a moment. "Yes, I am. And I don't just do this for the money. I do it because I have no choice." The room felt heavier now, as though the weight of her words hung between them. She continued, her voice slightly quivering but still firm. "I didn't want to end up like this. No one does. But life, it doesn't always give you the luxury of choice." She exhaled slowly, her fingers nervously tapping on the edge of the bed. "My son, he needs medicine. Without money, how can he survive?" John was silent for a moment, contemplating her words. There was a deep sadness in her voice, an ache that went beyond the immediate circumstances. Amy's voice dropped even further. "If I had the chance, if I had the education, if I had a steady job, things would be different. But I don't, and my son, he deserves better." Her eyes shifted toward the floor, and her expression turned somber as she continued. "I come from a poor family, from a rural village where women like me are seen as nothing. My grandmother, she only cared about the boys. She was so obsessed with having sons that she had 5 daughters, one after another." Amy's voice cracked as she spoke, but she quickly regained her composure. "When I was born, my mother died during childbirth. My father, he blamed me for her death. He never looked at me the same way again." She paused for a moment, her thoughts drifting back to the past. "The rest of my sisters, they blame me too. Every day I was reminded that my mother's death was my fault." John could see the pain in her eyes, the years of hurt buried beneath her words. Amy looked back up at him, her expression hardening. "But one sister, my second oldest, she was different. She cared for me, loved me, and made sure I survived." Amy's voice dropped even further. "If I had the chance, if I had the education, if I had a steady job, things would be different. But I don't. And my son, he deserves better." Her eyes shifted toward the floor, and her expression turned somber as she continued. "I come from a poor family, from a rural village where women like me are seen as nothing. My grandmother, she only cared about the boys. She was so obsessed with having sons that she had 5 daughters, one after another." Amy's voice cracked as she spoke, but she quickly regained her composure. "When I was born, my mother died during childbirth. My father, he blamed me for her death. He never looked at me the same way again." She paused for a moment, her thoughts drifting back to the past. "The rest of my sisters, they blame me too. Every day I was reminded that my mother's death was my fault." John could see the pain in her eyes, the years of hurt buried beneath her words. Amy looked back up at him, her expression hardening. But one sister, my second oldest, she was different. She cared for me, loved me, and made sure I survived. Amy's eyes grew distant as she continued. She left, and that was the last I saw of her. I tried to contact her to ask for help, but she had become someone else, someone who no longer cared about the family she had left behind. John listened intently, his heart heavy with the weight of her story. He wanted to say something, to offer comfort, but the words didn't come. What could he say? Amy's gaze turned inward, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought I would always have her. But once she was gone, I was alone again. No one to help me, no one to care. She shook her head as if shaking off the memories. And here I am, stuck in this life with no way out. She smiled faintly, as if to dismiss her sorrow. But I do what I have to do. For him. John looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sympathy and confusion. For him? Who's him? My son, she replied simply. I do it all for him. Her words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, the world outside the room seemed to fade away. John didn't know what to say next. He didn't have the answers, but he could feel the gravity of her choices, the desperation in her voice. Amy didn't expect him to understand. She didn't expect anyone to. But she was used to this, used to being misunderstood, used to carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. She wasn't greeted warmly, nor was she welcomed back with open arms. The only thing she could do was finish high school and get that diploma. With it in her hand, she left for the city. Her life was about to take a new turn, though she had no idea yet that it would lead to tragedy. In her naive, youthful mind, she believed that with her diploma in hand, she could go to university just like the heroines in the TV shows she watched. She imagined a future filled with success, a stable job, and the possibility of returning home to support her family. She even dreamt that her father would no longer despise her. But she was wrong, very wrong. She was just a rural girl with a high school diploma. Her academic record wasn't impressive. She had no letter of recommendation from teachers, and most importantly, she had no money. With no funds in her pocket, which university would take her in? She wandered the bustling city streets, her stomach empty, and her head filled with confusion. Then she saw it, a job advertisement for a karaoke bar, looking for service staff. She had no idea what working at a karaoke bar really meant. In her innocent mind, she thought serving just meant delivering drinks or fruit to customers. It sounded simple, like a harmless job, but she was mistaken. It wasn't about just serving drinks. The reality was far from what she had imagined. When customers ordered drinks, they expected her to comply without question. If they asked her to drink beer with them, she had no choice but to accept. The only rule was not to spend the night with the customers, but everything else was up for negotiation. On the third day, she worked with 2 other girls to serve a large group, about 78 people. She couldn't remember exactly. They were business people, celebrating after signing a deal. After they toasted and cheered, the customers insisted she drink a beer, a drink she had never touched back in her village. She tried to keep it together, but soon the alcohol took its toll. She became disoriented, unaware of where she was or what was happening. The next morning she woke up in a strange room. The bed was neatly made with white sheets and blankets, and there she was, alone. She felt a strange coldness in her body, realising that she was naked. Her clothes were nowhere to be found. She looked around the room, her eyes landing on a thick stack of cash beside her, 500,000 dong. As she held the money in her hands, a realisation hit her. She had lost something far more valuable than money. She wasn't just another girl. People now saw her as a prostitute in this bustling, chaotic city. She was only 18, still a child, yet here she was, caught in a web she never imagined. She had made so many wrong decisions, thinking that life in the city would be better, thinking she could escape her past, but instead, it had all gone terribly wrong. She felt a deep shame, but it wasn't just about the money. It was about how naive she had been. She had taken the wrong job, made the wrong choice, and most of all, she had left home, running away to a place she didn't understand. She had no idea what this city really was. Frantically, she dressed herself in the clothes scattered on the floor and headed back to work. She needed answers. Who was the man who brought her here? She wanted to meet him, face him, and confront him. How could he treat her this way? Did he really think that money could buy everything? That with enough money, he could turn every woman into a prostitute? She wanted to throw that money back at him, but she knew it wouldn't make a difference. She confronted her boss, asking about the man who had brought her to the hotel. The boss seemed hesitant, almost afraid. He told her that he didn't know the man, and that it would be better for her to not cause trouble. After all, she had only worked for 3 days. But then he handed her an envelope filled with money, her salary for the month, plus the cash left in the hotel room. She counted it, 50 million dong. The amount stunned her. It was more than she had ever dreamed of. But as she held it in her hands, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had lost something far more precious. 50 million. Was it worth selling her dignity for that amount? She didn't know. In that moment, something else crossed her mind. This money was so much, far more than she needed to buy back the life of her missing sister, the one she had been searching for. She thought back to what the woman had told her. Once I take your sister to the other side, my job is done. Whether she lives or dies is no longer my concern. But even without her sister, this moment felt like a loss. She wanted to go home, to the place where she had come from, even though no one there would welcome her back. There was no warm embrace waiting for her. Her family didn't care about her anymore, but somehow she wanted to return. There was something about the familiarity of home, even if it was filled with resentment. She had always bragged to her friends about her family, telling them how she came from a home with 5 daughters, the new Long Kong Chua, the 5 princesses who represented prosperity. But now, the reality was far different. No one at home was proud of her. No one even looked at her the same way. And yet, when anyone asked about her family, she would speak of them with pride. Then, in the midst of her thoughts, her phone rang. The screen displayed her father's number. Her heart skipped a beat. Had he been worried about her? Had he finally decided to call her back? She picked up the phone, her voice trembling slightly. Hello? A cold voice came from the other end. Where have you been? You think you can just run away and forget your responsibilities? It was her father, but his tone was harsh, and his words pierced her like ice. She tried to explain, but he cut her off. You think you're important now? You think you're a big shot just because you left? Well, don't bother coming back. There's nothing for you here. Her heart sank. The person on the other end wasn't her father. It was her sister, the one who had always been the hardest on her. Her sister's voice was sharp and cutting, and it felt like a slap in the face. The coldness in her words made her question everything she thought she knew about her family. She hung up the phone, the weight of it all crashing down on her. The city felt colder now, emptier, and more distant than ever. Even though Ms. Amy was just 1 year younger than her older sister, it felt as though the gap was much wider. Her sister had never shown her any affection, not even a sliver of kindness. Every time they spoke, her sister's voice grew louder, sharper. If you're so capable, don't ever come back, her sister would yell, her words cutting deeper than a knife. This family doesn't welcome a child who killed her own mother. Those words, the sting of her sister's accusations, felt like a needle pricking her heart, each sharp poke of pain digging deeper into her chest. She had no answer, only questions that spun endlessly in her mind. Why? Why did my sisters treat me like this? We share the same blood, the same mother, yet they refuse to love me. Why did my father create us, only to abandon me? She could still hear her father's voice, always silent when it came to the truth. He knew the truth, knew that her mother hadn't died because of her. It was because her mother had given birth to too many children, had kept birthing one after another without proper care or rest. Her health had deteriorated over time, weakening her body until it could no longer handle the strain. When her mother died, it wasn't Amy's fault. It was the result of years of neglect, of too many pregnancies and no nourishment. Yet from the moment Amy was born, she had never known the warmth of her mother's love. And worse still, her father had never shown any affection for her either. The only one who had tried to step into her mother's shoes was her second sister, who had tried to be both a sister and a mother at the same time. But even that felt like a heavy burden that Amy could never bear. As her sister continued her tirade, Amy felt the words become more distant, as if they were coming from somewhere far away. Her ears began to ring, the sound of her sister's voice blurring into an unintelligible hum. Her mind had long stopped paying attention. Why bother listening? Why continue caring? She had reached a point where she couldn't hear anything anymore. With a sense of finality, she ended the call, taking the phone out of her hand and removing the SIM card. She threw it far away, as though casting away the last remnants of her past. She swore to herself that she would never return to that house again, no matter what. Even if she had to die in some alley, abandoned and forgotten, she would never go back. John's voice broke through her painful thoughts, pulling her back to reality. So, have you decided yet? His simple question seemed to help her escape the painful memories of the past. She wiped the tears that had begun to fall from her eyes. It was so hard to stop herself from crying every time she thought back on her past, but she reminded herself that it was all over now. The most important thing was to live for the present. She tried to force a smile, looking up at him. "Are you serious about this?" she asked. "Really serious?" He nodded. "Yes, I am serious." "Then, I agree," she said, relieved yet still unsure. Part of her was afraid he was playing a joke on her. But if he wasn't, then it would be a blessing. John waited a moment, then added, "You know, it took you quite a while to decide." Amy looked down at her hands, uncertain. "I was thinking about something else, something about my life." John raised an eyebrow. "What about your life?" Amy let out a quiet laugh, though it didn't feel light-hearted. "If my life were a novel, people would buy it. But I'll tell you right now, my story is one I only tell at night. In the mornings, I have to work." She paused, then continued, "I work at a garment factory. I have a regular salary, but it's barely enough to cover the hospital bills." John didn't seem particularly interested in the details. "That's fine. I don't need to know the specifics." "I understand," she said, nodding. "But I'll need to take the morning off from the karaoke place." John's expression softened. "You don't need to go there anymore. It's a place that brings up too many bad memories for you." Amy felt a sense of relief wash over her. "All right, I won't go there anymore. And just so you know," John said, turning to leave, "I'm not asking for anything more, just this." "Wait," Amy called out. "What's your name? You've never told me." John stopped at the door, pausing for a moment before answering, "My name is John." The next morning, John visited a colleague in the hospital. It was a coincidence that this colleague was in the same ward as the young boy Amy had been talking about earlier. Something about it felt almost like fate, like he was meant to be there. After visiting his colleague, John made his way to the room where the boy was. When he entered, the boy's eyes lit up. "Are you my mom's friend?" the boy asked, his voice bright and innocent, as though he hadn't expected a visitor at all. "I'm so happy to see you." John smiled, but he couldn't help but notice something familiar about the boy. The boy's face held a resemblance to someone he had known, someone from his past. But try as he might, John couldn't remember exactly who it was. The boy, noticing John's confusion, introduced himself. "My name is San, or Xuan, that's what my mom calls me." John was taken aback. The name sounded strange to him, unfamiliar in a way he couldn't explain. It was a name he had never heard before, yet something about it tugged at his memory. Miss Amy shook her head lightly. "No, my name is San," she said softly. For a moment, John looked confused, unsure of what she meant. He thought she might be saying something about the meaning of her name, but as he saw her face, he realised it wasn't what he had expected. "San?" he asked, trying to confirm. She nodded, and he paused for a second. He wondered if she was explaining something personal, something more significant. "My mother always told me I was her sunshine, her light. That's why she named me San," she added, almost as if trying to justify her name. John looked at her and smiled, his expression softening. "What a beautiful name," he said gently, as he patted the little boy on his head. The boy, no more than 3 years old, beamed at the compliment, his chest swelling with pride. "Your name is really beautiful, San," John continued, his voice full of sincerity. The little boy, who had been staring up at John, seemed delighted by the praise. "Thank you," he said brightly, his voice full of innocence and wonder. His reaction made John smile even more. The child's joy was so pure, so untainted by the world around him. John found himself thinking about his own future. He wondered if he would ever have a child like this, a child who could bring such joy and innocence into his life. Despite his age, he didn't have a family of his own, but in that moment, as he watched little Sam smile, something stirred in him. Perhaps one day, he thought, he too would have a family of his own. John spent a few more minutes with the boy, playing and chatting, enjoying the time with them both. But inevitably, he had to return to work. Reluctantly, he said his goodbyes. "I have to leave now, but I'll come back soon. Next time, I'll bring lots of gifts for you, Sam." The boy's face lit up at the mention of gifts, his small hands clapping excitedly. It had been 3 days since their brief meeting, and John still hadn't called her. Amy couldn't help but wonder if he had changed his mind. She had tried to push the thought aside, but the doubt lingered. Did he see her as something temporary? Would he discard her once he had gotten what he wanted? The uncertainty gnawed at her. What if he had found someone else? What if she had been nothing more than a passing interest? Amy had wanted to call him, but then she remembered she didn't even have his number. The realization made her feel even more isolated. She had no way of reaching him, no way of knowing if he would ever follow through. She felt powerless, caught in a waiting game, hoping that he wouldn't turn out to be like the others, someone who saw her as nothing more than a brief escape from their mundane lives. But then, on the evening of the 4th day, her phone rang. It was him, John. His voice on the other end of the line was slurred, as though he had been drinking. "Come to the hotel," he said in a low, almost sleepy tone. She could hear the undertones of alcohol in his words. She wasn't sure what to make of it, but she agreed. She wasn't going to turn down the call, not now. Not when she was still holding on to the faint hope that he hadn't forgotten about her. When she arrived at the hotel, she knocked lightly on the door, her heart pounding in her chest. As soon as John opened the door, he pulled her inside. His arms wrapped around her, and before she could react, he kissed her urgently. It was forceful and rough, leaving her startled, but she quickly reminded herself that this was part of the responsibility of being his lover. Before she had time to think, he pushed her onto the bed, ripping off her clothes as if he were in a hurry. Amy, frozen by the intensity of the situation, didn't know what to do. She had never experienced anything like this before, not since she was 18 and had been in a similar, though less frantic, situation. But that had been different. This time felt more urgent, more pressing. She lay there trying to stay calm, hoping that he would be done quickly. But the minutes stretched on, and the experience was not at all what she had expected. There was no tenderness, no warmth, only hurried, almost mechanical movements. She couldn't help but feel a sense of helplessness wash over her. After a few more minutes of hurried activity, John finally pulled away. Amy remained still, her body aching from the intensity. He seemed to realise what had just transpired, and a look of regret crossed his face. He looked at her closely and noticed the swelling on her lower lip. "I'm so sorry," he muttered, his voice softer now. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this. I didn't know what came over me." Amy stared at him in disbelief. He had just apologised. But this wasn't an ordinary apology. This wasn't the type of apology she had ever received before, not from anyone. It was almost as though he genuinely felt remorse for what had occurred, for his lack of control. She didn't know how to respond. No one had ever apologised to her after something like this, and it caught her off guard. "It's okay," she replied quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not your fault." John looked at her, his face filled with something between regret and sympathy. "I was drugged," he explained. "Someone slipped something into my drink, and I couldn't control myself. I'm really sorry." She looked at him, still processing his words. He was drugged? That didn't make any sense. But then again, people did strange things when they were intoxicated. He had seemed so composed before, so controlled. She could barely reconcile the man she had met with the one before her now. But as he continued to apologise, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of gratitude. How many people would apologise after something like that? How many men would show remorse instead of treating her as if she were just another commodity? "Thank you," she said softly. I appreciate your apology." She wasn't sure what else to say, so she remained quiet as John got up to take a shower. She lay there on the bed, her mind racing. She was trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. He said he was drugged. Did that mean he had been in situations like this before? What kind of life did he lead that would bring him to this point? And what about her? What kind of person was she becoming? Amy slowly got up, still feeling the sting of the experience, but not entirely angry or upset. Instead, there was a strange calmness inside her. She had been through worse, and she knew she would survive. But the questions still lingered. Later, after taking a shower herself, she returned to the hospital to care for her son. She wanted to make sure he didn't see her in the state she was in. Life resumed its normal pace. She worked during the day, and in the evenings, she returned to the hospital to be with her son. Despite everything that had happened, she kept moving forward. She told herself that things would get better, that somehow things would work out. John called occasionally, though his calls became less frequent over time, but he still sent money. Money that helped cover her bills and provided some comfort. A few months passed, and one evening, after an exhausting and emotional time together, she rushed to gather her things to head back to the hospital. John, noticing her hurry, asked, "Is your son's condition serious? Why is he always in the hospital?" She paused, adjusting her clothes, trying to stay composed. "No," she replied, "he's not. But he's been under observation. It's better this way." John watched her carefully and she continued, "It's better here than the rented apartment we live in. The place we're staying is falling apart. At least the hospital is clean and safe." She didn't know what else to say. She couldn't explain it all to him, not now. Not when everything was so complicated. As she dressed and prepared to leave, she reflected on how she had arrived at this point. A life of struggle, a series of compromises. But as she looked at her son, she knew she would do anything to make things better for him. "John, would it be all right if I moved in here with Kusan?" Amy asked cautiously, her voice trembling slightly. She glanced nervously at him. "But is that okay? This is your home and I'm just your lover. How could I possibly bring my child here?" John understood her concerns and responded with a calm tone, trying to ease her worries. "Why wouldn't it be okay? I live alone here, and the house feels so empty without anyone around. Bringing you and Kusan here would make it feel much livelier." Amy hesitated for a moment, her mind racing with doubt, but John continued, offering reassurance. "I know this might feel like a big step, but it'll be fine. I'll even drive you both to the hospital if you need to go. You won't be alone." Upon hearing this, Amy's face lit up with relief. She couldn't hide the joy in her eyes. "Really? You'd do that for us?" "Thank you so much, John." John smiled softly, ruffling her hair affectionately. "It's no problem at all. Are you ready to go?" Amy gave him a warm smile, hugging him tightly. She could feel her eyes begin to sting with unshed tears. He had been so kind to her, the second person in her life, besides her sister, who had treated her with such care. A minute later, she released him from the embrace. "Okay, let's go. We can't keep the appointment waiting." A few days later, Amy and her son Kusan moved into John's house. It was the first time Kusan had ever lived in such a big house, and he was absolutely fascinated by it. He couldn't resist touching everything he saw, picking up this item and then playing with that one. Amy, feeling a bit anxious, watched him closely, worried that he might break something of John's. "Kusan, don't touch that," she gently reminded him. "What if you accidentally break something? We can't afford to pay for it." Kusan, listening intently to his mother, immediately stopped and withdrew his hand. Though he was tempted by the shiny objects, he knew better than to disobey his mother. His wide eyes showed his fascination, but he quietly respected her wishes. John, overhearing this exchange, chuckled. "It's all right, Amy. Those are just decorative items. Don't be so hard on the little guy." Amy smiled, but still felt a bit uneasy. "I just don't want him to ruin anything. He's so curious, and I'm afraid he might break something important." Kusan looked up at her, his eyes full of innocence. "I'm sorry, Uncle John. Your things are really nice, but I won't touch them anymore." John smiled warmly. "It's okay, little one. You can look, but don't touch." He then turned to Amy, his voice softer. "You're too hard on him. let him explore a bit. Amy's heart ached. She wished more than anything that she could buy Susan all the things he loved. His eyes sparkled with wonder every time he saw something new. It broke her heart that she couldn't provide those things for him. "Don't worry, Kusan," she said, lifting him up in her arms. "Tomorrow, Mommy will buy you a new toy, okay?" Kusan smiled brightly. "Okay, Mommy." His face lit up, and for the first time in a long while, Amy felt a small sense of joy. That night, after Kusan had fallen asleep, Amy found herself still wide awake. She noticed John was still working in his office, typing away at his computer. The soft glow of the screen illuminated his face as he worked late into the night. Amy quietly made her way to the kitchen and poured a cup of milk. She carried it into his office and gently placed it on the desk. "You should drink some milk, John. It's good for working late." John looked up from his computer, his eyes tired but appreciative. "Thank you, Amy, but you should go to bed. It's late." As Amy stood there, she noticed John was still focused on his work. She tried to peek at what he was doing on his computer, but the text was filled with terms and figures she couldn't understand. However, one line caught her eye. It was bolded at the top of the screen, "Development Plan." Curious, she asked tentatively, "John, what kind of work do you do?" John looked up from his screen and smiled softly. "I'm the head of business development for a company. It's a lot of work, but it pays the bills." Amy nodded, though she still didn't fully understand what it meant to be the head of business development. From what she could gather, it seemed like a prestigious job. "So, you must make a lot of money, right?" John laughed lightly, shaking his head. "My salary isn't as high as you think. It's just enough to get by and cover my living expenses, but it's enough to take care of you too." Amy blushed at his words, feeling embarrassed. She gave a shy smile, feeling a warmth spread in her chest. As Amy turned to leave the room, she noticed a small pile of A4 sheets in the trash can beside the desk. They were printed on one side and completely blank on the other. She hesitated, then pointed to the trash. "John, are you throwing these away?" John looked at her and shrugged. "You can take them if you want. I was just going to toss them." Amy, without hesitation, collected the sheets and walked out of the room. Before she left, she turned back to him. "Don't work too hard, John. Go to bed early, okay?" It wasn't until a few days later that John realised why Amy had taken the discarded paper. She had given it to Susan so he could draw. The sight of the young boy carefully sketching on the paper was something John would never forget. As the days passed, John learned more about Kusan. The boy had a natural talent for drawing, and he spent hours creating his own little world on paper. One day, John returned home earlier than usual and decided to stop by a toy store to buy some new art supplies for the boy. He picked up some high-quality coloured markers and a superhero model kit, hoping to bring some joy to Kusan's life. When he got home, he couldn't help but smile. He was certain Kusan would love these gifts. He didn't know why, but seeing the boy happy filled him with a sense of contentment he hadn't felt before. It was as if the child had brought something new into his life, something that had been missing for a long time. When John arrived at the house, it was unusually quiet. He assumed Amy and Kusan hadn't come home yet, so he decided to check the living room. As he approached the room, he could hear soft voices coming from inside. Curiosity piqued. He opened the door to find Amy and Kusan sitting together on the floor. Amy was wearing her company's uniform, looking every bit the hard-working mother she was. She was helping Kusan with his drawings, guiding his tiny hand as he drew lines and shapes on the paper. Amy had just returned home from work. She hadn't even had the chance to change out of her clothes yet. She walked into the living room where her son was busy drawing and curiously asked, "Who are you drawing, my dear?" San, with his tiny fingers, pointed proudly at his picture. "I'm drawing you, Mum, and Uncle John." Amy smiled, surprised. "Why Uncle John? Do you like him that much?" San looked up innocently, his small face full of curiosity. "Mum, is Uncle John my daddy?" Amy's heart skipped a beat. She could clearly see the sadness in her face for a moment, but just as quickly, she forced a smile, trying to keep things light. "No, darling. Uncle John is just a friend of Mummy's. Why do you ask?" San's voice softened with a hint of sadness. "I've never met my dad. Is Uncle John better looking than my dad?" Amy was taken aback by the question, unsure how to respond. How should she explain to her son that she, too, didn't know what his father looked like anymore? She couldn't even answer Sam's question properly. She simply avoided it, trying to steer the conversation in a different direction. Sam's innocent voice broke through again. "Mum, is my dad very far away? Will he come back when I grow up, like Uncle John?" The little boy seemed sad, but Amy saw his deep love and concern for her. He truly cared about her. He was such a sweet child. Whatever she said, he would follow. Amy gently patted Sam's head, trying to comfort him. "Don't worry, darling. We'll talk about this later. Why don't you sit here and keep drawing? Mommy is going downstairs to cook dinner, okay?" Sam nodded. "Okay, Mum." As Amy left the room, she glanced at the clock. It was getting late, and she knew John would probably be home soon. She smiled softly to herself, thinking about the evening ahead. But just as she stepped out, she saw him. John was standing there in the hallway, his arms laden with shopping bags. He'd just arrived, apparently. "Hey, you're back already?" she asked, her voice a bit surprised. John nodded, a slight grin on his face. "Yeah, I just got in. You weren't in the room, so I came over here." Amy looked at the bags in his hands, her eyes following them with curiosity. "When did you get back?" she asked. "I just got in," John replied casually. "Go change. I'll head to Sam's room for a bit." "Okay," Amy said, not really sure what he was planning, but, "You sure you don't need anything?" "Go change, Amy," he chuckled. "I'll be fine." Once she was out of sight, John made his way to Sam's room. Amy was still in the hallway, wondering about everything, the life she had built, the choices she had made, and the way John had become such a constant presence in their lives. A moment later, she heard John's voice calling out from Sam's room. "Hey, don't worry about cooking tonight. I just got paid, so let's go eat out. I'll treat you all." Amy didn't say anything, simply nodding, though she was embarrassed. She hadn't expected such a lavish offer, especially with the bills piling up at home. But she didn't want to ruin the moment. She wasn't used to John being this generous. John then walked out of Sam's room, holding a small toy in his hand. "Here, Sam, I got you something." Sam, who had been playing with his toys, looked up and beamed with joy. He wanted to run over to John to embrace him, but halfway there, he hesitated, remembering his manners. "Hello, Uncle John," Sam said, standing politely. John patted the boy's head with affection. "Good job, buddy. Here's a gift for you." Sam's eyes lit up as he eagerly took the toy from John's hands, though he hesitated at first. "Thank you, Uncle John," he said with gratitude. John smiled warmly at him. "You're welcome, Sam. Don't forget to play with it, okay?" Sam hugged the toy tightly to his chest. "I love it, Uncle John. Thank you." Amy couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. It was clear that Sam had never had toys like these before, such expensive toys. And here was John, offering them so casually. She looked at him, feeling a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. "Thank you, John," she said softly, though she was clearly uncomfortable. "But, you don't have to buy him so much. It's too much." John smiled nonchalantly, dismissing her concerns. "It's nothing, really. It's just a little gift. I got paid today, so it's no big deal. Don't worry about it." Amy, unsure of how to react, simply nodded, unable to argue. Later that evening, the three of them headed to a fancy restaurant, looking like a perfect family. John, the grown man with a calm demeanour. Amy, still young and attractive. And Sam, the little boy with his innocent, cheerful face. As they sat down, the waiter brought the menu to their table. "Good evening. What can I get for you tonight?" John glanced over the menu quickly before turning to Amy. "Have you decided what you want?" Amy stared at the menu, unsure what to order. The prices seemed impossibly high. One dish was nearly $1,000,000, and there were other expensive options, French or American dishes costing even more. What are these prices? She thought. It felt like a meal could cost more than gold. "I'll take care of it," John said, as he grabbed the menu from her hands. Without hesitation, he ordered steak, crab soup, and a few seafood dishes. Amy's face turned red with embarrassment. "John, that's way too much. Are you sure we can eat all this?" John smiled, not concerned at all. "Don't worry, we'll eat it all. By the way, does anyone in your family have allergies to seafood?" Amy, a little stunned by his confidence, could only manage a soft response. No, we're fine with seafood, I guess. The meal went on, and soon the bill came. John paid without a second thought, handing his card to the waiter. Amy had no idea how much the dinner cost. She didn't even want to know. That night, after they had all returned home, Amy noticed that John seemed preoccupied. He was lying on the bed, staring up at the ceiling with a thoughtful expression. "John, what's wrong?" Amy asked gently, sitting next to him. John shook his head. "Nothing. I'm fine." Amy, concerned, ran her fingers through his hair. "Are you sure? You seem troubled." John smiled faintly. "I'm just thinking about things." "Do you want me to massage your head again?" Amy asked. "You always say it helps when you're feeling down." John laughed softly. "Yeah, it does. I guess I could use one." Amy gently placed his head on her lap and began massaging his scalp. It was a simple gesture, but it always seemed to soothe him, to bring him some peace. John closed his eyes, the stress of the day slowly melting away under her touch. For a brief moment, it felt like everything was right in the world. Amy gently massaged the sides of John's temples, the soft, rhythmic movements bringing him a sense of calm. It was almost as if the touch was a tranquilizer, soothing his mind, as though he were taking a moment to breathe deeply. The silence in the room enveloped them both, and John closed his eyes, letting himself relax. Meanwhile, Amy continued massaging, hoping that for just a few minutes he could forget the weight of his day, the exhaustion that seemed to consume him. After a while, John spoke, his voice breaking the quiet. "I'm curious about something. If you're not comfortable answering, just let me know." Amy looked up at him, slightly puzzled. He continued, his tone thoughtful. "I've never been one to pry into other people's lives, but since I met you, everything about you makes me want to know more. I can't explain why exactly. There's just something about you that compels me to understand." Amy listened carefully, her heart skipping a beat. She couldn't quite place why he was so interested in her, but his words left her with a sense of unease. He paused for a moment before asking another question. "What about Son? Does he not know about your existence? I mean, if someone had a heart, surely they wouldn't leave their own flesh and blood to suffer without helping, would they?" Amy took a deep breath, her fingers still lightly pressing his temples. "I'm not sure. Maybe he doesn't know," she replied quietly. John, still not satisfied with her response, seemed to dig a little deeper. "You don't seem very convinced by that answer." Amy chuckled softly, a sad smile curling at the corners of her lips. "Do you want to hear about Son?" John nodded, his curiosity piqued. "Please, tell me." Amy began her story. Son, well, he came into this world under very complicated circumstances. But there's something I haven't told you, something I keep hidden. Son was abandoned by his family, rejected by those who should have cared for him. She paused, her voice growing softer as she recalled the pain of those days. "After receiving a call, I wandered aimlessly, like a ghost with nowhere to go. That's when I met Hugh. She took pity on me, and I stayed with her for a while. She offered me a place to stay and even helped me find a job. She treated me with such kindness, I didn't know how to repay her." Amy's voice cracked slightly as she continued. A month later, Hugh married. Her husband's family was wealthy, and they didn't want her to work, so they suggested she stay home and help with the family business. She left, but before she did, she paid my rent for 3 months in advance, leaving me in her debt. Even now, we keep in touch. Her life is happy, and I never let on that I'm struggling. John listened intently, absorbing every word. "Did Hugh know about your situation, though?" he asked, sensing something deeper. Amy shook her head. I never told her about Son or my struggles. I couldn't bear for her to worry about me. She's got a wonderful life now, and I didn't want to burden her further. John nodded, understanding the complexity of her situation. "But I still don't understand. How did you end up pregnant?" Amy sighed, her fingers still massaging his temples, though her mind seemed far away. "Well, I worked at the garment factory for a month. Most of my co-workers were older, and they treated me like a younger sister. I got along well with everyone, but then one day during lunch, I saw one of the women. Her face was pale, and there was blood on her clothes. At first I thought it was just her period, but then she collapsed and cried in my arms." She paused, as if the memory was painful. She told me that she had just had an abortion. She was already a mother of 2, but her life was hard, and this third pregnancy was unplanned. She couldn't keep it. The pain of losing her child was unbearable, she said, but she had no choice. Amy felt the weight of the woman's words, as if they had shaken her to her core. Hearing her story made me think about my own life. I hadn't realised until then how much I wanted to be a mother, but I was so young, only 18. I couldn't even imagine being a mother at that age. She paused again, her voice trembling. I found out I was pregnant at 6 weeks. I went to the doctor, and the ultrasound showed a heartbeat. I was shocked. My first thought was to get rid of it, to take the pills and end it before it was too late. But just before I did, something happened. I felt sick, and for a moment, it made me stop. I couldn't do it. It was my child. How could I end its life when it had done nothing wrong? John's heart ached as he listened, his chest tightening with the weight of her words. He couldn't understand why life had been so unfair to her, why some people had everything while others struggled so much. He reached out and gently placed his hand on hers. Amy, you are so young. No one should have to face such a difficult decision at that age, but I'm glad you didn't go through with it. Your child deserves a chance. Amy smiled softly, grateful for his understanding, even if he didn't fully grasp the depth of her pain. I didn't know what to do at first, John. I was lost, confused, and scared. But now, I'm just trying to figure it all out, one step at a time. John sat in silence for a moment, his mind spinning with everything he had just heard. He couldn't imagine what Amy had gone through, but he knew one thing for certain: she was stronger than she realised. Amy couldn't help but wonder, who was this man? At that moment, her mind couldn't process anything.
She wasn't sure if she was ready for this step, but John was persistent. He told her that his mother was kind, that she would understand, and she wouldn't judge her. Eventually, after some persuasion, Amy agreed. The journey took about 4 hours by car. San, tired from the long trip, fell asleep quickly, his small body curled up on the back seat. When they arrived, John's mother was waiting eagerly. She had prepared a feast, everything fresh from the market, the warmth of the meal, the hospitality. It was a welcome change from the life Amy had grown used to. But when Amy's mother-in-law saw little Sam, she paused for a moment. Her eyes flickered with something Amy couldn't quite read. "Who is this?" she asked softly, her voice laced with a hint of confusion. Amy quickly responded, "This is my son, Sam. He's my little boy." The old woman studied them for a moment, and Amy noticed the brief flicker of disappointment in her eyes, though it disappeared just as quickly. "Oh, I see," she said with a smile. "Well, let him wash up. We're going to have a good meal, all right?" Amy nodded, relieved that the tension seemed to ease. Little Sam, now awake, greeted his grandmother with a shy smile, and the moment passed. The warmth of the room seemed to welcome her, and for the first time in a long while, Amy allowed herself to feel like she might belong. "Let's have lunch. Mom's finished cooking," John said, his voice warm as he gestured for Amy to follow him. Amy smiled faintly and nodded. "Thank you." She felt a little awkward, but she followed him through the house, trying to relax. As they reached the back of the house, John led her to the bathroom. "Go wash your face." Amy nodded again. John's mother had been nothing but kind to her, and though Amy was grateful, she also felt the weight of her presence, like she didn't quite belong. As Amy washed her face, she overheard John speaking softly to his mother. Curiosity got the best of her, and she leaned closer to the door, trying to hear the conversation. She could only catch fragments, but one part stood out clearly. "Are you sure you really love her, and it's not just pity?" Amy froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but she couldn't help it. She needed to know, was John truly in love with her, or was he just feeling sorry for her? She heard his voice, calm yet determined. "I love her, Mom. I really do. There's no pity in her." His words sent a mix of relief and confusion through her. She hadn't expected that. His mother's voice came through filled with concern. "I hope you're right. I just don't want her to end up hurt. If things go wrong, it's her heart that will break the most." Amy felt a tightness in her chest, understood, and she wished more than anything that she could be sure of everything too. John's mother continued, her voice softer now. I raised you alone after your father passed. I know how tough it is. I just want to make sure she's not going to be left broken, especially if she has a child. Amy's mind raced. She wasn't concerned about the child. John's mother had already accepted her. But what if he wasn't truly in love with her? What if it was all just pity? That thought lingered painfully in her mind. When his mother finished speaking, Amy heard John sigh deeply. I understand, Mom. I'll make sure to take care of her. There was a long pause before he added, but I love her for who she is, not out of pity. After hearing that, Amy felt a strange sense of calm, though her heart still ached with uncertainty. Minutes later, his mother spoke again, her voice gently urging, It's late now. You should go rest. Tomorrow's a long day for both of you. John walked out of the room, and as soon as the door clicked shut, Amy stood still in the hallway, her emotions swirling. He was right there, just on the other side, but she felt like she was standing at a great distance from him. Her thoughts were scattered, too many emotions running through her mind.
She turned toward him when she heard his footsteps. You heard all of that, didn't you? John asked softly. Amy nodded, her face flushed with embarrassment. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to listen in. John smiled gently, though there was a flicker of concern in his eyes. It's okay. Come on, let's go inside. My mum's waiting for you. Amy entered the living room, and his mother was already there, looking a little surprised. She gave Amy a warm smile. Can't sleep? Amy smiled back, though it felt forced. Not really. She walked over and gently took the older woman's hand, grateful yet anxious. Thank you for accepting me, for everything, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. His mother patted her hand, her voice soft but firm. You don't need to thank me. Just love my son, and that's enough. We're family now. Amy nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude, though doubts lingered in the back of her mind. I will, she promised quietly. The next day, John and Amy had to return to the city. They both had work the following Monday. As they prepared to leave, John's mother gave her a kiss on the cheek, and Amy felt a deep warmth in her chest. She hadn't expected to feel so welcomed, so accepted. Before they left, Amy took a moment to say goodbye to John's mother again. She kissed her cheek gently and thanked her once more, overwhelmed by the kindness she had received. The car ride back to the city was quiet, with John driving, and Amy lost in thought beside him. Her mind kept drifting to the conversation she overheard. She could tell John cared for her, but the uncertainty still lingered. As they neared the hospital later that day, a phone call interrupted their silence. Amy's eyes widened with a mix of concern and fear as she listened. She had no choice but to leave for an urgent matter. There was something wrong, something she needed to attend to. I have to go to the hospital, she said, her voice shaking slightly. John glanced over at her, concern written all over his face. Is everything okay? She nodded, but her mind was racing. I'll be fine, I need to go now. Later that afternoon, Amy was at the hospital waiting anxiously. The doctor came in with the test results, holding a manila folder in his hand. He didn't look pleased. This is strange, the doctor said, frowning. There's something very unusual about these results. Amy looked at the doctor, trying to understand. What do you mean? The doctor pointed at the results. These numbers, they indicate a very high match. The two of you, you're related. Amy's heart stopped. She looked at John, her breath catching in her throat. Neither of them understood. How could this be? The doctor shook his head in disbelief. If you don't believe me, you can get a DNA test, but the results are clear. Amy looked at John, her head spinning. She didn't understand. How could this be? Had they really been connected in a way neither of them had ever imagined? John's mind was racing as well. Everything felt so surreal. He remembered something from years ago, a distant memory that now made sense. 4 years earlier, John had been at a karaoke bar with colleagues celebrating after completing a big project. He had stayed late and ended up in a hotel room with a woman he barely remembered. When he woke up, he was disoriented, unsure of what had happened the night before. What bothered him most was the message he found on his phone the next morning, sent by a colleague saying, "Hope you had a fun night with the beauty." At that time, he assumed she was just a stranger, a woman he met that night. But now, everything had come full circle. The realization hit him hard. This woman, Amy, she wasn't a stranger. She was connected to him in ways he never could have imagined. Miss Amy stood there, heart racing, as she looked at John. She hadn't expected this, hadn't anticipated him saying those words. Her mind felt hazy as the reality of what he was saying hit her. For a brief moment, everything around her seemed to blur, but his words grounded her. "You are my first customer," she whispered, almost to herself, her voice barely audible. John didn't say anything immediately. Instead, he reached into his wallet, pulling out all the cash he had. He placed it on the table in front of her, every bill a stark reminder of the situation they were both caught in. After he did that, he straightened his clothes as if this had all been just another part of the routine. And just like that, he left. But that wasn't the end. Amy, though, was left standing there, staring at the cash. She didn't know what to think. He had come into her life so suddenly, and now, just as quickly, he was gone. But his presence lingered like a shadow she couldn't shake. It wasn't long before John returned to her thoughts. Later, as she was in the middle of cleaning up, John called her. His voice, though familiar, carried a strange tone. "4 years ago, you worked at a karaoke bar and met Son's father. Is that right?" The question seemed random, out of place, as if he had suddenly shifted the conversation to something completely unrelated. But the curiosity in his voice was unmistakable. Amy paused. She hadn't expected this. "Yes, that's right. Why do you ask?" John didn't answer immediately. Instead, there was a long silence before he finally spoke again, his words coming out slowly, carefully. I need to tell you something." Before Amy could respond, John moved closer to her, his presence overwhelming. Without warning, he hugged her tightly. The sudden embrace caught her off guard, and she gasped for air, struggling to breathe as he squeezed her even tighter. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice breathless, but John didn't answer. His arms tightened around her, and he whispered something that didn't make sense. You are that girl." Amy froze. The words didn't register at first, but when they did, her entire body went cold. He continued, his voice now shaky. "I'm the father of San." The shock hit her like a wave crashing against the shore. She pulled away, staring at him, trying to understand what he was saying. "Are you telling me you're the father of Son?" she whispered, disbelief written all over her face. "You are the one from 4 years ago." John nodded. "Yes, I'm so sorry." His voice cracked with emotion. I never knew you were the one." Tears welled up in Amy's eyes, and before she knew it, they began to fall. She didn't understand why she was crying. This should have been a happy moment. After all, Son had a father. He was here now, but all she could feel was the crushing weight of the past 4 years. The man who had pushed her into the abyss was the same man who had come back to pull her out. And now she couldn't help but feel conflicted. Her heart was torn between joy and sorrow. John, seeing her distress, knelt down beside her. "I'm sorry," he repeated. "I should have been there. I should have helped you. I should have never let you fall into that darkness." Amy, unable to speak, simply nodded. The words were too painful to form, too much to process. All she could do was look at him, her mind racing with memories of that night. If only things had been different. If only he had been there. Maybe things would have turned out differently. John continued, his voice filled with regret. "If I hadn't been drunk that night, if I hadn't lost control, if I hadn't made that mistake, maybe things would have been different." His words hit her harder than anything. She could hear the self-loathing in his voice, and for the first time, she saw him for what he really was. Just a man, broken by his own mistakes. "I never should have thought of you that way. I never should have treated you like that. You didn't deserve any of this." Amy shook her head. She didn't want his apology, not really. What she needed was something more than words. She needed him to be there for her, to stand by her side. But now all she had was a distant memory of a night that had changed everything. She turned and walked over to where Son was lying on the bed, still unconscious. She sat beside him, holding his hand gently, as if trying to comfort him with all the love she had left in her. "Son, I'm here," she whispered softly. "Your father is here too. We're going to get you better. I promise." Son remained still, his eyes closed, unaware of the world around him. He was still in the haze of his illness, trapped in a world of dreams and shadows. John approached, his footsteps slow and heavy. "I'm going to make sure Son gets the treatment he needs," he said, his voice steady now, but with an undertone of determination. "I'll arrange for the surgery. The doctor said it can be done on Monday. After that, we can take a trip together, you, me, our son. We can finally be a family." Amy nodded, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She was exhausted, emotionally drained. She had never imagined her life would come to this, caught between the love of a father who had abandoned her and the love of her son who was still fighting for his life. John left the room to make arrangements and Amy stayed with Son, her thoughts drifting. She couldn't help but think about the past, about all the mistakes they had both made. But there was no use in dwelling on it now. They couldn't change what had happened. Later, as John made his calls, Amy felt a brief moment of relief. There was hope. For the first time in years, she felt like maybe, just maybe, things could get better. Later that night, John received a call from his mother. "You need to come home," she said. "Bring her with you. It's time we talked." John was surprised. They hadn't planned on visiting his mother tonight, but after a brief discussion, he agreed. He and Amy made their way to his family home, unsure of what awaited them. When they arrived, John's mother was waiting for them in the living room. The moment Amy stepped through the door, his mother gave her a curt nod, but it was clear that her attention was on John. "John, sit down," his mother ordered. John looked at Amy, uncertain, but he obeyed, sinking to his knees before his mother. Before he could say anything, his mother took a broomstick and hit him hard on the back. The pain was sharp, and John winced. "Do you know what you've done?" his mother demanded. He remained silent, knowing there was nothing he could say to make it right. His mother raised the broom again. "You brought shame to this family. You abandoned her. You let your own son suffer because of your mistakes." Amy, seeing John in pain, couldn't stand it. She quickly knelt beside him, trying to take the broom from his mother. "Please, calm down," she pleaded. "It's not all his fault. I've made mistakes too. I'll take responsibility for mine." But John's mother wouldn't hear it. "No, Amy, he needs to understand what he's done, and so do you." The tension in the room was unbearable, and Amy could feel the weight of the past pressing down on her. She wanted to do the right thing, but in this moment, she wasn't sure what that was. Amy's hands trembled uncontrollably as she looked at her grandson lying on the bed. A mix of anger and deep sorrow filled her heart. This was the first time she had met her grandson, and already she felt an inexplicable connection to him. His face had something familiar, something that reminded her of her own son when he was young. But the child was so thin, so frail, so sickly. Her heart broke when she learned that he was suffering from cancer, a disease so brutal that even adults struggled to endure it, let alone a child barely over 3 years old. How could a little boy, so small and fragile, survive something like this? Amy didn't know how to bear the thought. She could no longer sleep at ease, not like she used to back in her hometown. She stuffed a few clothes into a bag and quickly caught a ride to the city. The 4-hour drive seemed endless, and the closer she got, the more her anxiety grew. Her stomach churned with worry. When she arrived, she found her son still bedridden. His back was hurting, making it impossible for him to get up. Amy could only leave him for a while, for there was something more urgent to attend to, calming his mother's nerves. "Have you eaten anything on the way here?" the young woman asked kindly. "Let me cook something for you." Amy looked at her, and her heart ached. The girl was just over 20 years old, yet she had already endured so much hardship. "I'm sorry for troubling you," Amy said, her voice thick with emotion. The girl shook her head. "Don't apologise, Aunt. I'm the one who feels like I owe you. You've done so much for us." Amy took her hand gently. "No, child, I owe you. You've been so kind to me." After a moment, Amy asked about her grandson's condition. The young woman explained everything, her face filled with both worry and hope. "If everything goes well, Monday's surgery will give him a chance to recover," she said softly. Amy sighed in relief, though her heart was still heavy. Thank God for that. Take me to the hospital. I want to see him. At the hospital, Amy saw her little grandson lying on a hospital bed, his small body barely recognisable. The sight cut through her like a knife. He looked even thinner than before, his arms marked with bruises from needles. He was so frail, so vulnerable. Amy could barely contain her tears. She decided that she would stay at the hospital until he was safely out of surgery, no matter what. Time seemed to stretch on as she waited. Monday came, and the surgery began. Both the young woman and Amy's son's mother waited anxiously in the cold hospital corridor. The operating room lights remained on, signalling that the doctors were still working. The tension in the air was thick, and for what felt like an eternity, only the sound of footsteps echoed through the empty hallway. Then unexpectedly, a voice called out to the young woman. "Trang, is that you?" Trang turned, her heart racing. She could barely believe her ears. The voice was so familiar. It felt like a dream. As she walked toward the voice, she couldn't comprehend what was happening. When she saw the face of the person calling her, she froze in shock. It was her older sister, the one she hadn't seen in years. Her heart skipped a beat. She never thought she would see her again. "Oh my God, it's really you," her sister exclaimed, her arms wrapping around her tightly. "Trang, it's been so long. I've been looking for you for months. I thought I would never find you." Trang stood there, overwhelmed with emotion. She had never expected to meet her sister again. She was speechless, her mind racing with a mix of disbelief and relief. "Why did you leave without a word, Trang?" her sister said, holding her at arm's length and looking at her with tears in her eyes. "You disappeared for 4 years, and I couldn't find you. I've been through so much without you." Trang could only stand there, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hurt you. I thought you would be better off without me. I thought no one cared." Her sister sighed deeply, her eyes filled with sorrow. "I never stopped caring about you, Trang. I've missed you so much." For a moment, both of them cried together, the years of separation melting away. After they had calmed down, her sister asked, "How is your son?" "Is he still in surgery?" "Yes," Trang replied, wiping away her tears. "He's in the operating room right now. I'm so scared. I don't know what to do if anything happens to him." Her sister nodded sympathetically. "I understand. But don't worry, everything will be fine. He's in good hands." Trang suddenly realised that her mother-in-law was still standing nearby. "This is my mother-in-law," she said, introducing her sister to the woman. Her mother-in-law smiled warmly and nodded. "It's nice to meet you, dear." The two women exchanged pleasantries, but the conversation was short. After all, they both had so much to catch up on after 4 years of separation. Trang's sister explained that after she left home, she had married into a wealthy family. They had treated her kindly, seeing her sincerity and hard work. Her husband was 10 years older than her, and though their marriage wasn't filled with romantic passion, he had been a good, supportive partner. "I wish I had known sooner that you were in trouble," her sister said, her eyes full of regret. "I would have come back to help you. I'm so sorry I was so far away." Trang smiled weakly, grateful to have her sister back in her life. "It's all right, sister. I'm just glad to see you again. I never thought I would." After the reunion, the two of them talked late into the night, sharing everything they had missed over the past few years. For the first time in a long time, Trang felt a sense of peace. Maybe things could get better. Maybe there was still hope. The two of them had been living quite harmoniously together. However, there was one issue that had been a source of tension. Her husband's family feared that she might run away back to Vietnam, so they had cut off all contact between her and her own family. This continued until 3 months ago, when she begged her husband enough for him to finally agree to let her visit Vietnam. For the past 3 months, she had hired numerous private investigators to find her sister. And finally, when she succeeded, her sister was overjoyed. "Sister! I'm so happy! I thought you had been mistreated, abused, and not given food or water. I was so worried about you," her sister exclaimed with relief. Miss Amy laughed, the tension lifting a little. "At that time I was scared too, but thank God I made it through. I moved into his house." She hesitated for a moment before adding, "I haven't mentioned this, but my mother-in-law is Vietnamese. She understands what it's like to be a daughter-in-law in a foreign country, so she's never made things difficult for me. It's just that she listens to her son, so she never allowed me to visit my family." Her sister let out a deep sigh of relief. "That's such good news. I'm so glad you're safe and happy now. Look at you now. You're so fashionable. All your clothes are high-end. You've really made it, haven't you?" Miss Amy smiled and teased her. "You know, sometimes it feels like it's all just a joke." Her sister was genuinely curious. "So when are you coming back again?" "You've been gone for 4 months, spending 3 of those months looking for your family. Next month, you'll have to go back, right?" "Yes, I miss my daughter so much. I can't sleep without calling her every day," Miss Amy replied with a longing sigh. Her sister asked, "How many children do you have now?" "Just one, my little girl. She's over 2 years old," Amy answered. Her sister playfully remarked, "Your daughter is younger than my son. When they meet, my son will be the older one." Miss Amy laughed. "You're really asking for it now. Hasn't anyone ever taught you not to provoke your older sister?" The atmosphere between the two was warm and relaxed, much different from how tense it had been the previous night. It felt like a reunion after so many years apart. The connection between them had grown, and now their conversation was filled with laughter. They chatted for a long while. During this time, the surgeon came out of the operating room, smiling. The surgery was a success. They all erupted in joy. Miss Amy took her sister's hand with one hand, while her other hand reached for her mother-in-law's. Overcome with emotion, she whispered, "It's all worked out. It's really happening." In a moment of excitement, she called her mother-in-law Mom, a word she had longed to say for 3 years. Her mother-in-law and her husband both nodded in acknowledgement, and a sense of fulfillment washed over Amy. Now that everything had gone according to plan, Amy spent the next few days at the hospital waiting for her daughter to recover. Her sister stayed by her side, supporting her. She introduced her husband to her sister, and the two women exchanged messages through video calls to help bridge the distance. Amy's husband, though very young-looking, was 37 years old. If you only looked at his face, you'd never guess his age. Her sister couldn't help but feel proud. "Amy, your husband is more handsome than mine," she said with a proud smile. The day finally came when her sister had to leave, and they both felt the bitter sweetness of their farewell. But her sister promised that the next time she came back, she would bring her husband and daughter along. Amy would have a chance to see them again, and it would be a joyful reunion. Amy's daughter stayed in the hospital for another week, and the doctors confirmed that her condition had stabilised. She was able to go home, and now, with the love of her father and the care of her mother-in-law, Amy felt that she had finally found peace. She realised that even though she had spent years feeling isolated, she was now surrounded by love and support. "Thank you for everything, Mom," Amy said to her mother-in-law, as she noticed her daughter's progress. "But lately, I've been feeling a bit off. I feel so tired." Her mother-in-law looked at her with concern. "Why don't you go see a doctor? You've been eating poorly lately, haven't you? Is something wrong?" Amy nodded, her thoughts clouded. "I've been feeling a bit off lately, and I can barely eat anything." Her mother-in-law was suddenly alarmed. "Could you be pregnant?" Amy was taken aback. "Could it be true?" she asked, before quickly agreeing to take the test. The results came back positive, and Amy's mother-in-law was overjoyed. "Another grandchild! How wonderful!" she exclaimed. When Amy's husband heard the news, he nearly spun her around in his excitement. "This time, I'll be able to see our child before they're born. I'll get to hold them when they first come into the world. I'll teach them how to talk and walk. Everything." Amy smiled, feeling the warmth of his words. That evening she couldn't sleep. The excitement of the news and the promise of a new life made her restless. "Tomorrow we'll go and register our marriage. Next month we'll have a wedding, right?" Amy asked him softly. He smiled at her, saying, "Whatever you want, we'll do it." Amy chuckled. "You know, we're already like husband and wife with our 2 kids. This wedding is just a formality." "Yes, I agree. Let's get married legally first, then we'll plan everything else." Amy smiled at him, feeling the weight of the future lift off her shoulders. He gently rubbed her stomach, asking, "What do you want to name the baby?" Amy thought for a moment. "How about Moon? Like the moon in the sky?" He laughed softly. "Moon? You only know 4 words in English, and one of them is moon." Amy laughed, realising the absurdity of it. Yes, moon is the fifth word. He pulled her close for an embrace. It was the kind of hug only a husband would give his wife, comforting, soothing, and filled with love. In that moment, he whispered, "I love you." It only took him 3 seconds to say it, but he would spend the rest of his life proving it to her. Dear audience, you have just finished listening to the story One Night of Drunkenness. We hope you enjoyed it. Please continue to support our channel by subscribing, liking, sharing, and leaving your comments below. Thank you so much.